612 feet. That's the number, and I checked it twice because, as it turns out, it answers two completely different questions that have almost nothing to do with each other. In 1908, a company known across America for home sewing machines finished the tallest building on Earth, a slender tower rising out of a wide stone base at Broadway and Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan. About 59 years later, workers went back up that same tower with crowbars and cutting torches floor by floor for something close to 2 years. When they were finally done, 612 feet was still the number. It had just changed what it was a record for. By the second week of August in 1967, the wrecking crews were already something like 40 stories up. They worked from the top down, mostly, the way you take apart a thing you can't risk dropping all at once. A crane lifted sections of red brick and pale blue stone off the tower's crown and lowered them into the street below, and a fair number of men in hard hats walked the scaffolding at a height that had Fly about 60 years before been roughly as high as a person could stand on the surface of the earth and still be inside an office building. A controlled implosion brings a tower down in something close to 12 seconds, give or take. Nobody used one here. This building came apart the slow way, floor by floor, over something close to 2 years. Mostly because a structure engineered to hold itself up for centuries doesn't fall on cue just because somebody, somewhere, has decided they want the land underneath it. There was also, as it turns out, money in doing it slowly. A fair amount of the steel and stone coming off that tower had a resale value, and a crew that dismantled it piece by piece could sell off what an implosion would have only wasted. The building was the old Singer Tower, headquarters of the Singer Manufacturing Company, and for about a year in the first decade of the 20th century, it had been, roughly, the tallest building anywhere on the planet. By 1967, it belonged to a different owner entirely, one that had bought the whole block for pretty much one reason: it planned to tear the building down. A photographer working for a New York newspaper caught two workmen standing near the crane one morning that August, not doing much of anything, mostly just looking up at what was left of the tower above them. Neither one said much worth quoting, as it turns out. There wasn't a lot to say. A world record had stood for close to 60 years, and now it was coming apart under a crew of men who were, in a lot of cases, just doing a job, one stone block at a time. That's not a small number. 60 years. Most of the people who'd worked in Hat Lobby the year it opened were long retired, or gone, by the time the first crane showed up on Broadway. The tower itself ran 612 feet from the sidewalk to the roofline, with a slim ornamental lantern and a flagpole pushing the total closer to 674 feet. Take the flagpole and the lantern away, and you're still left with something roughly twice the height of the Statue of Liberty, torch and all, standing alone on a single Manhattan block, built to house a company that mostly made machines for sewing hems. The demolition crew wasn't tearing down a ruin either. The elevator still ran that August. The lights still worked mostly. What didn't work anymore, and hadn't for a while, was the math. Newspapers around the city had been running some version of this story for a fair number of months already. Not front-page news, most weeks. A paragraph here, an update there, a photograph of scaffolding climbing a building most readers had walked past their whole lives without ever really looking up at it. Reporters at the time kept reaching for the same comparison, roughly. A building that had once made the front page just for existing was now barely worth a caption. A few readers wrote in here and there, mostly asking some version of the same question. How do you tear down a record like that and not stop, even for a minute, to think about it first? Nobody at the paper had a fully satisfying answer, mostly because there wasn't one. Not really. The block had already been sold. The permits had already been filed. By the time most people thought to ask the question itself was close to 2 years too late. By the last week of August, the top 8 floors of the tower were gone. And then there was a date. Nobody wrote it down as a landmark day when it actually happened, but by the time the crews finished, 1968 had become, more or less, the year the Singer Tower turned into the tallest building anyone had ever deliberately torn down. Not one destroyed by an earthquake or lost in a war. One that a set of owners looked at, decided they didn't want anymore, and had removed on purpose, floor by floor, on something close to a schedule. That's not a rounding error. That's the number. And it held roughly for 53 years until 2021, when a bank a few blocks north tore down its own tower to build something taller in its place. By 1964, the math on the old Singer Tower had already stopped working, and it had stopped, as it turns out, years before anyone actually signed a demolition contract. Here's the part that gets skipped in most tellings of this one. The tower's floors, up in the section that actually reached towards 600 feet, were squares something close to 65 feet on a side. That's rigging. Haley, the footprint of a suburban house lot, stacked something like 40 times into the sky, with the elevator shafts and the stairwells eating a fair number of those square feet before a single desk ever went in. All told, the finished tower held about 410,000 square feet of office space, top to bottom, spread across its full 612 feet. The building that eventually replaced it, on that same footprint, held something close to 2.33 million square feet. A modern tower on the exact same block could hold roughly 5 or 6 times what the old one ever managed, and no amount of admiring the old lobby was going to change that arithmetic. The company that built it had already left by then, more or less. In 1961, Singer announced it was moving its headquarters uptown to Rockefeller Center, and it put the old tower up for sale. A real estate developer named William Zeckendorf bought the building and the rest of the block, hoping to talk the New York Stock Exchange into relocating there instead of staying where it already was. The exchange, in the end, said no. Zeckendorf, for what it's worth, was one of the most prominent developers working in the city at that time. A man with a long list of major New York properties to his name already. Even someone with his reach couldn't find a workable future for this particular one. His company held onto the property a while longer, still hunting around for a use for a 60-year-old tower with house lot-sized floors, and then, in 1964, sold the whole block to United States Steel. Singer wasn't alone in making that move uptown, roughly speaking. FYI. Our number of older companies were leaving Lower Manhattan for Midtown around those same years, chasing newer buildings with wider floors and shorter commutes for executives who mostly lived uptown themselves anyway. It wasn't really one company's decision so much as something close to an industry-wide one, made independently, in a lot of separate boardrooms. At close to the same time, U.S. Steel didn't particularly want the tower, as it happens. It wanted the land underneath it, and it wanted a headquarters that used the full width of the block instead of a narrow quarter of it. So it bought Singer's old home along with the building right next door, the City Investing Building, with the plan more or less already in place. Both would come down. One modern, 54-story tower would go up in their place, roughly twice as tall as the one it replaced. The City Investing Building came down in that same stretch of months, for close to the same reason, and ended up, by at least one count, as the third tallest building anyone had ever pulled down on purpose, right behind Singer's own tower. 2 records from 2 neighboring buildings set by the same demolition, on the same city block within months of each other. New York had by then only just created a Landmarks Preservation Commission, formed in April of 1965, roughly 2 years after the wrecking crews had finished with Pennsylvania Station a mile north, after a public outcry finally pushed the city into doing something about buildings like these. The Singer Tower was, by nearly every account from the period, one of the most admired buildings still standing in Lower Manhattan. The commission never designated it. In August of 1967, with demolition already scheduled, the commission's own director, a man named Alan Burnham, said something close to the quiet part out loud to a reporter. Landmark status alone wouldn't have saved the building. Somebody still would have needed to buy it outright. Or the city would have needed the money to buy it themselves. And neither of those things was close to happening in 1967. A law can keep a wrecking ball off a building for a while. It can't make anybody want to pay for what's standing inside it. Nobody in this particular story set out to destroy a world record. at least not on purpose, in the sense of meaning to. A company moved uptown because Midtown made more sense to it by then. A buyer looked for a use that never quite came. A new owner did the arithmetic on a full city block and reached the obvious answer for a business built on efficient floor space. None of that required a villain, exactly. It just required a string of ordinary decisions made about 3 or 4 years apart that added up eventually to a crane on a scaffold, 40 stories above Broadway, taking a world record apart with crowbars. By the time the Singer Tower had been open 5 years or so, something close to 100,000 people were passing through its lobby and its elevator banks in an average week, most of them on their way to offices that had nothing at all to do with sewing machines. The company itself only occupied a handful of floors up near the top. Just about everyone else in the building was a tenant, renting square footage from a sewing machine company that had more of it than it needed. At night, in its first years, the tower did something almost nobody in New York had seen a building do before. It lit itself up. Rows of bulbs traced the outline of the tower against the dark, one of the first buildings in the city dressed that way after sunset, something closer to a lighthouse than an office block. People on the Brooklyn side of the river, or so the story goes, could pick it out at night without much trouble at all. Stand there a minute. It's a Tuesday morning sometime around 1912, and you're walking in off Broadway. I threw a bronze door, taller than any door has any business being, something close to 24 feet from the sill to the top of the frame, cast with a pattern of needles and thread worked into the metal, so even the hardware announces whose building this is. Inside, the lobby ceiling rises through a run of small plastered domes, and the light coming off them reads closer to gold than white most mornings. Marble columns run down both sides, banded in bronze, and somebody at some point decided that something like 38 to ns of bronze was a reasonable amount of metal for one entrance hall, and nobody with the authority to stop them ever did. From the street, looking straight up before you came in, you could just about make out the copper dome at the very top, already green this early in the building's life, with a lantern and a flagpole rising above that. Adding something close to 60 more feet, nobody down at sidewalk level can really judge by eye. A carriage goes by behind you. Somebody's dropped a glove near the curb and hasn't noticed yet. Down past the lobby, on the lower floors, is where the company actually does business. Rows of sewing machines sit lined up under glass, and a salesman is walking a customer through a run of stitch patterns, and the smell of machine oil and new cotton mixes in a way that has nothing to do with the marble overhead. Underneath the bronze doors and the observation deck, this is still, mostly, a company selling machines to people who sew their own children's clothes, and mail-order catalogs bearing the same name are, right about now, arriving. In farmhouses a long way from Broadway, in something close to a dozen countries. Somewhere on one of the tenant floors above you, a switchboard operator is plugging cords into a board that serves the entire building, mostly without dropping a call, and a floor above that, a room full of typewriters is making a sound close to rain on a tin roof. If rain came down in short, deliberate bursts. You aren't here to buy a sewing machine, though. You've come the way a fair number of people came. Some from out of town, mostly just to walk through the lobby and take an elevator up. There are 16 of those elevators, and you wait behind a velvet rope, listening to the particular whine a hydraulic lift makes when it's working hard, a sound you'll still remember years later without being able to say exactly why. The operator running your car wears a uniform close to a doorman's, brass buttons down the front, and calls out the floor number in something close to a bored sing-song, the way somebody does a thing they've done 1,000 times already that week. A group of school children comes through the lobby, not long after you do, herded by a teacher who's clearly made this trip before, counting heads at the elevator bank before letting anyone through the gate. One of them presses a hand flat against a marble column, the way children do with anything cold and impressive, and gets pulled along before anyone can tell him not to touch it. Nobody minds, particularly. The marble has survived worse. The ride up takes longer than you expect. Somewhere around the 40th floor, or the 42nd, depending which account you believe, the operator op ends the gate onto an observation deck, and you pay something close to 50 cents for the privilege of standing at a height nobody in this city had stood at before, outside of a church steeple or a ship's mast. The wind up here moves the way it moves over open water, not the way it moves down between buildings, because at this height, there isn't much left standing to break it up. You can see the harbor from here, and the ferries crossing it, and the roofs of buildings you'd have called tall an hour ago, sitting well below your feet now like furniture somebody arranged and forgot about. Somebody near you is trying to point out their own office window, 6 blocks over, and failing, mostly, because 6 blocks over doesn't look like 6 blocks from 600 feet up. A guide of some kind, or maybe just another visitor who's been up before, is telling anyone nearby that on a clear day you can pick out something close to 30 miles of coastline, though nobody up here has a way to check that. Down in the basement, machinery you'll never see is doing quieter work. The building makes its own electricity, coal-fired boil. There's push steam heat through radiators on every floor, regulated by something close to 1,200 separate thermostats, an unusual number of small brass dials for a single office tower. The air moving past you in the lobby has already been filtered and given a little humidity before it ever reaches you. An early, clumsy, entirely sincere attempt at something later buildings would just call air conditioning. Nobody riding the elevator with you gives any of it a second thought. It's mostly just how the building works, the way you don't think much about how a light switch works. Later that same year, in January, the view from up here changes almost entirely. The harbor ices at the edges, the ferries move slower, and the wind that felt merely brisk in autumn turns sharp enough that the deck mostly empties out within minutes of anyone stepping onto it. The building doesn't mind either version of the weather, as it happens. It was built for both. By 4 in the afternoon, you're back on Broadway, and the tower is already doing what it will keep doing for close to the next 55 years. Standing there, in defeat, errant to whether anyone below happened to notice it that particular day or not. The tower would stand for about 59 more years after that Tuesday, give or take, and come down, in the end, in less time than it took to build. In 1902, the Singer Manufacturing Company already owned a building on that block, and it wasn't big enough anymore. The company's president at the time was a man named Frederick Bourne, and Bourne hired an architect he'd already worked with more than once, Ernest Flagg, to figure out what to do with a headquarters the company had more or less outgrown. Flagg's first answer was a tower of 35 stories, tall for 1902, but not especially unusual in a city that had been building skyscrapers for something close to a decade already. Bourne looked over the drawings and asked for close to double that height instead. Construction ran from 1906 into 1908, and when the tower topped out, it reached 612 feet, topping the previous record holder, a building called Park Row, by something close to 225 feet, which is roughly the height of a 20 steep. Rye building stacked on top of the old record, just to get past it. A slender lantern and a flagpole pushed the total higher still. Flagg had designed the base to fill the entire block, 12 stories of it, and let the tower itself rise narrow and mostly alone above that base, using something close to a quarter of the lot. He dressed the whole thing in a fair amount of ornament borrowed from French styles, a mansard roof and carved stonework closer to a Paris hotel than a New York office block, so the building read as decorated even at a height where, by then, almost nobody could actually see the decoration from the street. Flagg, for what it's worth, spent a fair amount of his career arguing that tall buildings shouldn't be built the way most of them were being built around him, all bulk and no setback, blocking light and air off the street below. The Singer Tower was, in a lot of ways, his own argument made physical, a slim, mostly private tower rising off a wide public base. It just happened to also set a world record nobody had specifically asked him to chase. None of this would have been possible 10 years earlier or so. The tower's foundation was sunk using caissons, sealed chambers dug down through the wet ground of lower Manhattan until they hit solid rock, and the tower above stood on one of the first true steel frames used at this scale in the city, doing the structural work that thick masonry walls had always done before it. Flagg wasn't inventing any of that technology exactly. He was one of the first architects trusting it enough to go this high with it, and by the summer of 1907, roughly a year before the building formally opened, newspapers were already calling it the tallest structure in the world, well before the interior work was even finished. By the standards of the time, it was a genuinely restrained design for a building that size. And it was also, as it turned out, close to the exact design decision that would make the tower impossible to keep 60 years later. A narrow tower on a wide base reads as elegant from the street, mostly. It also means most of the usable square footage sits down low in the 12-story part, while the part that made the headlines is mostly elevator shaft and outside wall. Most counts put the finished tower at 47 stories. Some put it at 41 if you stop counting at the main roof deck and leave the lantern and the dome off entirely. And at least one careful accounting from the Times used that lower figure. I haven't found a source that settles, once and for all, which count is the fair one. Either way, in the spring of 1908, it was the tallest thing anyone on the planet had finished building. The tower held that title for something close to a year before the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company completed its own tower a couple of miles north, and Singer's headquarters became, more or less overnight, the second tallest building in the world instead of the first, a demotion nobody in 1909 seemed to lose a lot of sleep over. That's the number this video opened on. 612 feet. Built to be the tallest thing in the world in 1908. The same figure about 60 years later, belonging to the tallest thing anyone had ever deliberately pulled back down. Same number. Two records, pointing in opposite directions, separated by something close to 60 years and one genuinely bad decade for narrow office towers. Frederick Bourne didn't live to see any of that part. He died in 1919, having spent a fair amount of the fortune sewing machines made him on other Ernest Flagg buildings, including a boarding school chapel out in rural Connecticut that has nothing at all to do with Manhattan real estate. Flagg himself kept working for decades after the tower he was best known for went up, and he was, by most accounts, still alive, in his 90s, when the first serious talk of tearing the tower down started making the rounds in the early 1960s. There's no record, at least none I've found, of what he said about that, if he said anything at all. By the time anyone thought to ask his opinion, more or less, the wrecking crews had already started at the top. Today, in Brooklyn, at Pratt Institute, there's a room in a building called East Hall with brass chandeliers hanging from its ceiling. Students sit under them a few times a week, taking G-notes, mostly not paying attention, the way you don't really look at a light fixture in a room you didn't choose to be in. If you ask most of them where the chandeliers came from, they'd probably guess they came with the building, because that's the reasonable guess. They didn't come with the building. Those chandeliers hung once in the marble lobby of the Singer Tower under the plastered domes above the 16 elevators, somewhere near the bronze doors with the needle and thread pattern worked into the metal. When the wreckin', G-crews got down to the lobby level. In the winter of 1967 sliding into 1968, preservationists made one more attempt, not to save the whole tower anymore, which almost nobody thought was still possible by then, but just to save the lobby itself, the marble columns and the vaulted ceiling, and move it somewhere it could go on existing. U.S. Steel said no to that too. There wasn't much of a plan for where a marble lobby that size would go, and nobody, as far as the record shows, was offering to pay to make one. What did get saved was smaller. Somebody, at some point that winter, took the chandeliers down, crated them, and got them out to Pratt Institute, where they were installed in East Hall and have been hanging there more or less continuously ever since, doing the ordinary work of lighting a room where people study, among other things, architecture, without most of the people underneath ever knowing what they're underneath. That's the whole inventory, as far as anyone has been able to trace it. Some chandeliers, in a building most of the tower's own tenants never once visited, in a different borough entirely. Roughly 2 years after Pennsylvania Station came down a mile north of here, and about 2 years before the city's Landmarks Commission would have anything close to real teeth, the Singer Tower went the same way Penn Station went, for close to the same reasons, at close to the same speed. The commission that existed in 1967 could look at a building and admire it out loud. It couldn't yet buy one, or make anybody else buy one. That kind of authority took a fair amount longer to build than the tower itself ever had. It would be a decade or so, give or take, before the same law was tested in court over a different, still-standing terminal building a couple of miles north. And this time, it held. Pennsylvania Station, the demolition that started all of this, came down for close to the same set of reasons. A company that no longer needed the space it had. A market that valued the land under the building more than the building standing on it. And no legal tool yet built that could weigh those two things against each other. 2 Granite Eagles from that demolition ended up in a parking lot in New Jersey, roughly the same distance from Manhattan as Pratt Institute is, in more or less the opposite direction. Different building, different borough, close to the same ending. Singer really had outgrown its old headquarters. U.S. Steel really did need the square footage. The commission really didn't have the money. Every decision along the way made sense on its own terms, one at a time. And all of them together added up, eventually, to a crane on a scaffold, 40 stories above Broadway, taking a world record apart with crowbars over close to 2 years. The building that replaced it opened in 1972, 54 stories, taller than Singer's Tower had ever stood, built to hold far more people doing far more ordinary work. By most measures, it's a more efficient building. Almost nobody photographs it. Every so often, somebody researching the history of American skyscrapers tracks the chandeliers down to Pratt and stands underneath them for a minute, mostly just to say they've seen the one piece that's left. The students studying nearby more often than not have no real idea why a string is standing in the doorway looking up at the ceiling fixtures instead of at anything else in the room. There's no plaque under them, no small brass label explaining where they came from. If you want to know, you mostly have to already know to ask. The chandeliers are still in Brooklyn, doing the ordinary work of lighting somebody else's lecture hall, and that's the detail I can't quite get past. That the tallest thing anyone ever tore down on purpose came down, in the end, to a few light fixtures nobody looks at twice. One more thing we had, and set down, and walked away from.